The following is a special presentation of the Empty the Bench Podcast Network. Welcome to Tough Enough, a recap and breakdown show from the MMA Outsiders, following every episode of The Ultimate Fighter Season 32, Team Grasso vs. Team Shevchenko, presented by Playback. And now, here are your hosts, Tom Albano and Zain Bando.
All right, another episode of The Ultimate Fighter down, so it's time for another edition of Tough Enough. Tom Albano here along with Zain Bando from the MMA Outsiders here on the Empty the Bench Podcast Network, and I'm going to address everybody out there first before we get into anything. If you did not watch tonight's episode, maybe you just watch us because we can provide a good enough summary of everything, but if you did not watch tonight's episode and the fight that we're going to talk about later between Ramaska and Usmanov, if I can actually speak today, get your ass in front of a computer and watch that fight. Because what we're going to talk about the fight, we'll do a good job summarizing it, but it's not going to give the actual visuals of everything justice.
No, it's not going to do justice at all, and I'm not trying to pick anyone either, but for those of you who have yet to see this fight or even know the fighters that we're even going to be remotely discussing tonight, that probably means that you haven't seen much of the season. So go back, pushing up on the season, the divisions, the fighters, and of course the coaches. And as you catch up further, let us know what you think down in the comments below for this episode and in the episodes to come. And for those of you who don't know, this is a special edition live stream where every Tuesday night we come on here after every single episode of The Ultimate Fighter and chronicle what was We've done so throughout the first 5 weeks of the season. We're going to continue to do it leading up to the Ultimate Fighter finale. Before we get started, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe, as this is live and going across all of our different social media channels. So we would greatly appreciate if you should go to some love there. We would also greatly appreciate if on the YouTube side you were able to like this live stream, hit the notification bell. That way you don't miss anything that we have here at the network, including live streams of this very show, our flagship show of the MMA Outsiders, which aired earlier tonight. It was episode 90, where we chronicled everything that was UFC 303 and so much more. To do so, you can go to youtube.com/ETB Network. And even though this episode of Tough Enough and every episode of Tough Enough will not be available on the podcast platforms, you can still listen to the MMA Outsiders wherever you get your podcasts. And I guess if you want to do it in a little bit of a roundabout way, you can listen to this very show with YouTube Premium, so you can technically listen to the audio only side if you don't want to watch this as this is occurring. But I'm excited to be back here. This was definitely the best fight of the season by far. Maybe not the greatest episode in the world, but the fight over delivered, and I'm excited to get into it as we're nearing the halfway point of the season and what has already been a relatively competitive season from both weight class sides, both coaches, and so much more. Tom, is there anything you'd like to add before we move on, and also give a little bit of love to our sponsor, if you will?
Just go to etbpodcast.com also for more content and more information about the network, which includes a whole bunch of blogs that Zain and the contributors over at the blog section are putting out night in and night out. That is Zain Bando, staff writer for BJPenn.com, MMA Knockout, and the sporting news. I'm Tom Albano. Find my work at MMA News, Stansided MMA, and with the PFL. Let's go right into let's get right into showing love to Playback, the official sponsor for this show, the MMA Outsiders, and just everything at the Empty the Bench Network. So this edition of the Tough Enough, the Ultimate Fighter, Team Grasso versus Team Shevchenko Aftermath is presented by Playback. Watching sports is more fun with others, but we spend too much of our time watching alone. Playback is a virtual space where communities can stream live sports together with everyone perfectly synced up. Creators can hop on stage, deliver their own play-by-play analysis and commentary, and invite viewers up for Q&A. Playback social experience, from playing fantasy sports, repping your favorite players and teams, and watching with the commentators and communities you care about. Win or lose, sports are best enjoyed together. Join our community by going to playback.tv/ETB Network to find out more, including our live stream schedule. Okay, now with all of that out of the way, let's just jump right into the episode itself. Starting off, just a little recap with last week's episode, last week's fight. Omran Shaban and Shamdakhan Magomedov, one of the greatest comeback finishes that we've seen in modern TUF, if not just in TUF in general, with Shamdakhan getting the ankle lock, getting a leg lock on Shaban, and everyone, including UFC President Dana White, or UFC CEO Dana White, pardon me, thinking that the fight was pretty much going to be over and done, and Shaban getting out of the submission, basically choking out Shamdakhan. They were talking about, he did have the leg lock in, but, Shaban was able to loosen the hold, which might explain why he wasn't cranking it as well, because of the hammer fists and the punches that he was delivering. And then Shamdakhan didn't expect the choke, and then the next minute he knew, he woke up.
Yeah, the next minute he knew, he woke up for sure, and that's what happens on the Ultimate Fighter sometimes. You go into a fight thinking that it's going to go one way, and it goes the complete opposite. Obviously, as we know, this fight was supposed to happen a couple weeks ago. Obviously, a cold sore prevented that. Thankfully, the fight did still occur, and very interesting from my perspective to hear Dana say that maybe Shamdakhan needs a little bit more work. I would say 1 to 2 more fights, but he's definitely, and I'm sure you'd probably agree with this, he's definitely borderline UFC ready. He showed a lot of promise. It may not be his chance to move to the next level, and I think fighting a guy like Omran really showed a lot to where he still needs to improve, but still a lot of skills and a lot of attributes in his game that he can apply moving forward, both on the regional scene and maybe eventually in the UFC as well.
I mean, yeah, I'd say 1 or 2 more fights. He dominated most of the fight. He just got caught. And Dana talked about it. He said that's the fight game sometimes. Sometimes you just get caught, and then all of a sudden what was looking like your night is no longer your night. So I could definitely see 1 or 2 more fights. I don't think he needs to go through TUF again, or he needs to go through looking for a fighter contender series again. I think as long as he gets another win or 2 on the regional scene, he'll be signed almost right away.
I think so too, but you never know with how many short notice fights the UFC continues to make. He might fall into that exact category, but you never know. Overall, though, a good fight from last week. If you missed our recap from last week, go and check it out. We did a bit of a deeper dive into this fight, but now I want to move into the actual episode itself, because there was some interesting content leading up to the fight, starting out with the Zimantas or Ziga, as I like to call him. He was super worried. He was super worried about his weight cut in the lead up to the fight. Let's see, he had 9 more pounds to cut when the episode first started, I think it was, and he had a week to do it. And we did some math when we were off the air just before we were coming on to do this, and we realized, oh shoot, he had to cut a significant amount of weight, and it seemed that weight cut was really draining him. What did you think?
I mean, for full context, it seemed like he had 5 days from the minute that they aired the segment that they were recording. He had 5 days to lose weight. They were talking about something like 20 kilos. I'm like, yeah, I did the math conversion. Either Google and its AI system are playing with me, or that's about 40-ish pounds.
Yeah, I'm most definitely, whatever the case, it's definitely yeah, you're not wrong. It's about 44.1 pounds according to the conversion scale, which is a lot of weight.
I mean, I think back, Zain, do you remember the very first season of TUF? I don't know. I don't know if you've watched any of that, because I know you started in TUF with season 3. How much?
Yeah, I did went back and saw season 1.
So do you remember Bobby Southworth having to cut like 20 pounds in like a day?
I figured that you were gonna go somewhere with this, and it was exactly exactly that. And were you about to get to the part, or which I'm going to say, which is where Dana White essentially tells Bobby Southworth not to disrespect him.
Well, the thing is, none of the fighters here have disrespected Dan at all. It has been a very respectable season, for
That's
better or
true.
for worse, because I know there were people who loved the house drama.
True. Yeah, and you've definitely seen it toned down in the seasons currently. That could be a UFC decision, that could be an ESPN decision, but it's very much toned down to where you don't really see booze anymore. You don't really see fights in the house anymore. Um, yeah,
Sorry, I had to. Sorry, I took a big gulp of water. Yeah, I mean, I think that's more of a UFC decision because I think the later, I mean, the Fox seasons, when it was the live on FX, when it was on FS1, I don't remember seeing much booze really from there too. I mean, it did have its moments, like Jillian Lane, let me bang, bro. But
right. Yeah, I mean that was a moment in itself. But we really haven't had anything like that ever since. So
oh, okay. My point being though, like part of being, I guess, the warrior mentality with an MMA fighter is to cut so much weight in a short amount of time. But weight cutting has been such a major controversy within our sport that, it's true that he had to cut like 40 something pounds in less than a week. Yeah, that doesn't do good for your body, and that doesn't do good for the argument.
no, it's firmly isn't. So I would say I don't know about you, but I guess let's get to the elephant in the room that they both missed weight by the exact same amount of weight.
Yeah, so, which, by the way, I should add for fully context. Ramaska also normally fights at lightweight. He has fought at 155 on the regional scene, but in order to get onto this tough season, he was willing to cut the extra 10 pounds. Unfortunately for him, he ended up missing weight. Fortunately for him, his opponent also ended up missing weight, and by the same amount. Both of them ended up missing weight. Both Ziggy Ramaska from Team Shevchenko and Begzad Usmanov from Team Grasso both ended up weighing in at 146 and a half pounds. They were both supposed to have an extra hour to cut the extra weight, but Grasso and Shevchenko and Mullins all kind of looked at each other and said, nah, let's just have him fight 146 and a half.
Yeah, and it seemed like NSAC was cool with it. The UFC was cool with it. Coaches were on board with it. I'm sure ESPN executives were on board with it. I'm sure Craig Belichian was on board with it. So once everybody was on board with it, the fight and the preparation for the fight moved forward as such. And I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Outside of the backstories, which we're going to get to in a second, there really wasn't much further context as compared to last week when you saw both teams take their outings. It seems like that part of the season, or at least that beginning part of the outing spree of the season, is over. We're still
Yeah.
waiting. We're still waiting what the coach's challenge is going to be, but I as now with that being said, with that madness out of the way, I'm sure your heart kind of almost dropped for a second, thinking like, "Oh no, is this fight going to get canceled?" But thankfully, it didn't.
I mean, thankfully they didn't. Although I'm thinking about it, with Ramaska's sake, at least, if he gets a UFC contract out of this, and considering what the two did in this fight, it seems like they possibly might end up getting contracts regardless of what happens. But Ramaska would be fighting at lightweight then. There's no way it sounds insane enough for him to cut with his body to 155, let alone to 145. I mean, we've seen
1,000%.
I mean, we've seen big feather. Max Holloway is a big featherweight. Dan Hooker has a lanky body and manages to drop down to 155. It's just a matter of like we said, it doesn't do good for all the controversy about weight cutting and the methods and the madness involved with that.
No, it certainly doesn't. And what's even more interesting is is it seemed like neither of these guys really had a care in the world. As long as they could fight at a weight that they were comfortable with, that's what they went with. So you can't really.
Well, it kind of plays into how the fight ended up playing out.
No, it's true. But before you do that, you want to get into the backstories of the fighters first, because I feel like
Yes.
before we connect the dots, we have to complete the story first, right? So
Yeah, complete the story. Good, you're using a different terminology than the one you used last week. Let's talk about Ramas.
of course you had to bring that up.
Okay, let's talk about Ramaska. So Ramaska was actually the second featherweight Shevchenko picked, and the reason she picked him so high was that basically it was about his strength and the fact that, like I mentioned, he has such a lanky body that he has height advantage over most, if not all, of these featherweights. He has a reach advantage over most, if not all, of these featherweights, and he plays it to his advantage in his fights. And he's pretty strong and pretty durable.
Yeah, and it probably reminds Valentina Shevchenko a lot of herself, which is probably another reason why he was picked as high as he was. And even if I was on that team, he would have been in a top 5 for sure. And I'm sure you have a pretty similar sentiment too, right?
Fairly, yes. And you got to see. I mean, you saw a little bit of his fights, some of his fights over at Blade Fights, which I believe Blade Fights 1. He ended up winning a 4-man one-night tournament. So shows you what he can do when it comes to fights, and we'll talk about what he can do in fights when we talk about this fight. We didn't get to see too much of his training, though. They focused more on the fact it kind of a unique background that he spent quite a bit of time with the Lithuanian military. He didn't necessarily compete in any sort of wars. He was more of a peacekeeping kind of service with the military, as
which
kind of put it.
Which is super ironic considering that his next career he's striving to be a professional fighter. So that's a little bit ironic if you think about it in the grand scheme of things.
I mean, Zain, the whole idea of mixed martial arts being martial arts is kind of ironic in itself too. The fact that martial arts is supposed to be this very traditional, this very, all this talk about discipline and stuff, and that's there in MMA. But in the traditional martial arts, you also don't see all those celebrations after beating somebody's brains in and knocking them out.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
You did get to see some footage of Ramaska's time, working at a gym, and then his time training at a gym. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, did he say it was in the basement of a synagogue in Lithuania?
That sounds right, because A, he did say it, and B, that's just an ironic place to train.
The irony is all around there in Ramaska.
Because it almost seems sacrilegious, if you will.
Well, I'm sure if you take a poll of most priests and rabbis and such, they can be very anti-MMA.
It's true.
But I guess there is reasons for why it would be in the basement of a synagogue and kind of kept away from public eye. And then, as we were talking about, maybe a little bit of a disappointment that it focused more on his backstory as opposed to, the training side of the backstory. But when it came to Usmanov, it was kind of the other way around. You got to hear a little bit of his backstory too. The fact that he moved to, I believe it was Thailand when he was 12 years old, ends up training in Muay Thai, moves to the United States only 2 years ago, and ends up training at Jackson Wink, which, I mean, your first training camp at an American gym, and it's only at one of the most prominent in the world, only has, no short of a few Hall of Famers and several champions.
Yeah, so you're definitely in a very good place from that regard, and you want to talk about being in the presence of legends, and being in the presence of guys who win in absolute wars. That's essentially what this fight ended up being. So it almost looks like a perfect storm. So
for sure.
I guess I guess getting into the actual fight itself was.
Oh, no, hold on.
Oh,
I should mention what his game plan. We saw the game plan with Ziggy. His Usmanov's game plan was basically cutting angles and trying to use combat, which is normal when it comes to when you fight a guy as tall as him and a guy that you have a significant height and reach disadvantage. You'll try to cut off the ring or the cage. You'll try to use angles and work combinations and go in and out. You might do rope-a-dope techniques. We talked on episode 90, Zan, about the Teofimo Lopez title defense, and you kind of saw that a little bit with him, how he stayed back, circled around the ring, and worked his combinations and moved all around.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
All right, let's give the 5 seconds, but honestly, like I said at the start of the show, if you've even made it this far, heed our warning. You want to watch this fight, but okay. All right. In perhaps one of the greatest fights in modern TUF history, if not one of the greatest fights in TUF history, it's Ramaska from Team Shevchenko who gets the win over Bekzad Usmanov. It was a 2-round decision, but don't get us wrong. The fact that it only lasted 2 rounds instead of going to a full 3, it was highly competitive. It was fun. It was action-packed. It was violent, especially that first round. And Dana White's jaw basically was on the floor for the whole last 3 minutes of that first round.
Yeah, if you haven't seen this fight and you were to describe this fight in one word, it was an absolute masterpiece. This was one of those fights where they just went in there and they're like, we're gonna go in there and we're gonna swing it and we're gonna slug it out, and that's exactly what happened. Ramaska threw everything but the kitchen sink at Usmanov. Usmanov is hanging tough, throwing back punches of his own. Eventually drops Ramaska near the end of the first round. Seems like he's turning the momentum, and it's going to get interesting. And then they come back in the second round and they do the exact same thing over and over again. And it was just like you didn't know what was going to happen next, but it was almost like you were on pins and needles watching that. And I'll be quite honest with you, I said some choice words at my television screen when it was determined that it wasn't going to go to a third round because I couldn't believe it.
Unfortunately, I think Ramaska did do enough over the course of the 2 rounds to get the win.
He probably did, but come on, man, from an excitement standpoint.
I know, from an excitement standpoint, but when you're looking at the, look, the thing that impressed about Usmanov was that, it was 2 things. Number one, Dana White's comment about, I don't know how much more the little guy could take, and then he drops Ramaska twice during the first round. The thing is, I would probably still have given that first round to Ramaska because, yeah, he got the fight to the ground, but unfortunately, I don't think Usmanov did enough to really, the referee was forced to stand him up.
Right, and then and obviously Ramaska was able to quickly get off his back almost right away. So that probably played a factor into it as well. If you would have held him down for 30 seconds, maybe another minute, 2 minutes, you never know.
Yeah, I guess he didn't want to deal with Ramaska's limbs while on the ground. And number 2, the thing that was impressive about Usmanov, maybe even more than that, was that just the durability. Because Ramaska, I love a guy, Zan, who, and maybe it's just because this is my UFC Undisputed 3 playing style, the kick-based offense, just the heavy kicks, on the body, on the head, and Usmanov just ate them all. Like, that is a tough, durable SOB. He is incredible.
It's true. He's like one of those video game characters where his overall might be a 77, but his gas tank is like a 92, and you can't
I think that's perfect description. I think it's a perfect description for both of them.
No, it's true. felt like you were watching a CPU versus CPU video game, and it was like you didn't know what the next twist and turn was going to be, but it eventually ended up being legitimate and in real life, obviously through reality. But this was a huge win for Team Shevchenko. Obviously, he gets them back in the competition. You said that this was a must win for them before Team Grasso might have taken a stranglehold, but now as we move into the second half of the season, I think things are going to get very interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I did say that Team Shevchenko needed a win here. They got the win. It's now 3-2.
Yep.
So they win next week. Everything, we got an even amount of participants in the final 8, but amongst the 2 weight classes. It'll be interesting to see how the rest of the season plays out. I feel bad for the next 2 fighters who have to follow this fight.
I do too.
Speaking of, to wrap this episode up, let's talk about next week. The next middleweight fight. You got Tom Teixeiras coming out of Team Grasso, taking on Ryan Loder from Team Shevchenko. I believe Teixeiras is the Canadian who is a big-time striker. And then you've got Ryan Loder from Team Shevchenko, who is American with a very disciplined, very strong wrestling background.
Yeah, so you got Loder, who's obviously won a fight against the brother of Edmund Shabazian, who was a Dana White Contender Series alumni. Ryan Loder comes in at 6-1, and Thomas Theochrist comes in at 9-5 with a little bit more experience. But they both been around. Obviously, Theochrist, the American, he's fought for Alaska Combat, Unified MMA out of Canada, and of course EFC. Yeah, I accidentally said that he was an American. He's the Canadian. And Loder.
I was going to say, so Theochrist is the Canadian, I believe.
Yeah. And you got Ryan Loder, who's at 6-1, and fought a couple of different places. Fought for Unified as well. Fought for Uriah Faber's A1 Combat, which is a very, very prominent promotion out of California. This fight has all the makings just on paper to be as good, maybe if not even a little bit better than the fight we saw this week. And I think even though, we mentioned this in earlier episodes too, Tom, but even though it's not the holy cow sexiest coaching match, the talent on this season is surprisingly pretty good. And it seems like every single episode, the fights continue to get better and better. And I'm excited to see what the second half looks like, because sometimes you get halfway through the show and you realize that all the good talent is fought. We still have a couple more guys where we don't know what their ceiling is and what their floor is. So the remainder of the season has a chance to be very fun. And it seems like the momentum is slowly starting to build towards a finale that might actually be very, very interesting.
So, all right, so let's talk about that, because they didn't show a lot of the footage from the fight for next episode. But what really is sticking out in the preview for next episode, Loder seems to get into a fight with Edwin Cooper Jr., a member of his own team. And you see the two of them trading curses at each other, and Shevchenko screaming at the two of them to be martial artists. Something's going down. And I mentioned it before we came on. Edwin Cooper Jr., he's prominently featured in the intro video. He's like the first member of Team Grasso that you see. But we haven't really seen much of him, if anything at all, throughout all the segments on this show.
No, we haven't. And even looking back on his background, he's one of the most experienced guys of the entire cast. So to see that, he's not, has not fought in the octagon as of yet, and is pulling antics like that ahead of Ryan Loder's fight, when he should be supporting his teammate and not trying to viciously fight him in sparring. There's something brewing, which I think is good. It leaves you on a cliffhanger. It makes you want to watch the next episode. It makes you want to continue to follow the season to see what happens. And that's what we're going to try to do next week, is to try to make sense of what happened in this mini so-called beef between Loder and Cooper Jr. But with that being said, that's going to do it for another edition of Tough Enough. And this is Tough Enough, the special edition live stream, The Ultimate Fighter, Team Grasso versus Team Shevchenko Aftermath. Before we get out of here, be be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the Empty the Bench Podcast Network because we're slowly but surely approaching 1,000 subscribers. So every single like, share, repost, retweet, any social media medium, if you will, is really helpful. You can follow the network across social media at ETB Network. You can follow this very show, the flagship show of the MMA Outsiders, at MMA Outsiders ETB. You can follow myself on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Bando99. You can follow Tom himself at Thomas J. Albano. And I'm Tom, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week for another edition of Tough Enough.
Wait, did you say that's Zain on Tom?
I did it again, yeah. I did it again. I have to do it at least once a year, though, so I did it again. For those of you guys who don't know, you have to go all the way back into the archives of the best of to see the mistake that I made last year, which made the intro to the best of episode. So I did it again. Again, totally unintentional, but it happened again.
All right. I think we're tired. Good night, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Good night, everyone.